What would you do if the only justice that existed was the justice delivered by the most feared men in the backlands? Men whose rules were carved not in paper but in blood. That question haunted every villager who heard the distant echo of leather sandals on dry sand, because when the outlaw chiefs rode in, mercy was never guaranteed. Their punishment methods were whispered across the Sertao like forbidden scripture, a set of rituals so severe that even hardened soldiers struggled to understand how one mind could invent such cruelty. And yet, these punishments were not random. They followed a dark internal logic, a code built from survival, loyalty, and the constant threat of betrayal in a world where every shadow might hide a traitor. The first thing outsiders never understood was that punishment among outlaws wasn't simply violence. It was theater. Every act had an audience, a purpose, a message. One misstep inside the camp could lead to a punishment designed not just to hurt the body, but to fracture the soul. Chiefs like Lampiao and Carisco learned early that fear was currency. Control depended on rituals that made even loyal men question whether they truly knew the limits of their leaders. A thief caught stealing food might face a method that mixed humiliation with suffering. A suspected spy could be punished in ways meant to stain memory itself. And yet, the true horror lived in the uncertainty. No one ever knew which line, once crossed, would trigger retribution. Some punishments were silent, executed under moonlight, hidden behind Katinga branches, preserved only in the trembling voices of those who survived long enough to speak. Others were public displays meant to freeze an entire village into fearful obedience. But beneath all of it lay a question that still puzzles historians today. How did these chiefs decide who deserved punishment and who deserved protection? The answer is buried somewhere between brutality and strategy, between the need to maintain loyalty and the constant paranoia that someone within their ranks would turn them over to the villain. Many accounts suggest that the moment a chief sensed doubt, even faintly, he acted swiftly, because hesitation was a luxury no outlaw leader could afford. What you are about to uncover in the next part goes far deeper than folklore. These punishments were shaped by hunger, drought, vengeance, desperation, and the psychology of men forced to live outside every system except the one they built for themselves. And if some of these methods seem extreme, remember that the Sertao was a place where the line between survival and destruction disappeared with the sunrise. Before we continue, tell me something. Have you ever seen a situation where fear controlled people more than any law? Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like if this glimpse into the outlaw world is already opening your eyes, and check whether you are subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because what you will discover in the following section might challenge everything you thought you knew about how these chiefs truly ruled. The deeper you go into the outlaw world, the more you realize that punishment did not begin with violence. It began with rules, unwritten laws passed from chief to chief, whispered to recruits on their first night beside the fire. These codes were not designed to create fairness. They were designed to keep the bando alive in a landscape where betrayal could strike faster than a bullet. Every outlaw who joined the group learned quickly that loyalty was the only true currency, and the cost of breaking that loyalty was often paid in flesh. But how did these codes form, and why were they so brutally effective? Inside the camps, the hierarchy operated with precision. The chiefs created a system where every man watched the next, a constant internal surveillance that made disobedience feel like a kind of suicide. Discipline was enforced, not through speeches, but through examples. A single punishment could redefine the camp's atmosphere for weeks. Chiefs like Lampiao, known for both charisma and cruelty, crafted a psychological environment where loyalty was rewarded, hesitation was punished, and questioning an order no matter how small could set off consequences that reshaped the group's entire dynamic. The code that emerged from this atmosphere became a living organism, adapting to threats, constantly evolving to meet the shifting dangers of the sertão. What outsiders rarely understand is that these internal rules weren't simply inherited traditions. They were forged in blood, shaped by decades of ambushes, betrayals, and shifting alliances. When a chief saw a comrade fall because someone failed to follow an order, that mistake became part of the code. When a recruit abandoned his post and the entire group suffered, That cowardice became another line carved into the unwritten law. Over time, the code became as feared as the chiefs themselves. Punishments grew more intricate, more symbolic, because they were not merely aimed at disciplining a single man but at sculpting the group's collective psychology. These codes also served another purpose, one that historians often overlook. They created identity. In a world where the state considered them criminals and the church condemned them as sinners, the outlaw code gave the congacheros a sense of belonging. It told them who they were, who they could trust, and who they had to fear. And because this sense of identity was built not on ideals but on survival, it carried a weight more powerful than any legal system. Every rule, every punishment, every ritual reinforced the idea that life inside the bando was the only life possible. Leaving was more dangerous than staying. Disobeying was worse than dying. But the more rigid and brutal these codes became, the more they revealed something else about the chiefs. A growing obsession with control. As the bandos expanded and the risks multiplied, so did the severity of the rules. Chiefs demanded absolute obedience, because anything less left openings for the volantes to strike. And when a leader lives in constant fear of being hunted, that fear contaminates every decision he makes. This is how punishment evolves from necessity into ritual, from discipline into something darker, something tied to the personal paranoia and authority of each chief. As we move deeper into this story, another question takes shape beneath the surface. If the codes were built to protect the group, what happened when the very rules meant to preserve the bando became weapons used against its own members? The answer emerges when we look at the next layer of their world, where punishment was no longer a warning but a sentence delivered under the silent gaze of men who knew their fate could shift with a single breath. The moment a man was accused inside the camp, everything changed. Conversations fell silent. Fires crackled a little too loudly. Even the air around the accused seemed to thicken, as if the Sotao itself were holding its breath. What happened next depended entirely on the chief, because the outlaw world had no courts, no priests, no appeals. Judgment lived in the eyes of one man, and the rituals he followed were as unpredictable as the landscape they roamed. Some chiefs preferred swift decisions, delivering punishment before anyone could question the reasoning. Others drew out the process, letting fear settle over the entire group like a suffocating blanket. A psychological weapon more powerful than any blade. These judgment rituals were rarely spoken of, even among Kongash. Those who witnessed them often avoided describing what they saw, because to name the process was to relive it. The accused was brought before the chief, sometimes surrounded by the entire bando, sometimes in the shadows where only a handful of trusted men could watch. The silence that followed was deliberate. Chiefs understood that fear sharpened obedience, and the act of making the accused wait, exposed and uncertain, created a tension that seeped into everyone else. A man watching the ritual knew that next time it could be him standing there. If there was evidence, it was rarely presented formally. Evidence came in the form of whispers, suspicions, or the shifting loyalties that define life on the run. A misplaced word, a strange disappearance, a glance that lasted too long in the wrong direction, all could be interpreted as signs of betrayal. Chiefs trusted instinct above all else, and those instincts were sharpened by years of ambushes, traps, and losses that carved permanent scars in their judgment. Even so, deciding guilt was not always about truth. Sometimes it was about control. A chief who felt his authority slipping could reassert dominance by turning the ritual into a warning for anyone who dared question him. But even more chilling was the moment just before the verdict. The camp seemed to freeze, every man secretly analyzing the chief's expression for clues. Would he show mercy, or would he make an example of the accused? This uncertainty was deliberate. Punishment in the outlaw world was not simply retribution. It was strategy. A harsh sentence reminded the Bandu that loyalty was not optional. A lighter one suggested that Chief was confident enough to show restraint. Either way, the decision radiated outward, shaping morale, trust, and the delicate balance that kept the group together in territory where survival was a daily negotiation. Those who study the Kangako today still debate whether these rituals were acts of justice or expressions of deep paranoia. Perhaps they were both. Living under constant threat reshaped the minds of these men, creating leaders who relied not on laws but on instinctive calculations about danger. A chief might punish one man severely to prevent a small fracture from becoming a full rebellion, or he might spare a guilty recruit if he believed that forgiveness would strengthen the bond within the group. These choices were rarely explained, and that lack of explanation was part of their power. When the verdict fell, it carried the weight of finality, and the consequences echoed through the camp long after the ritual ended. Yet the most disturbing aspect is not the rituals themselves, but what they reveal about the evolution of power within the outlaw world. Every judgment, every accusation, every sentence added another layer to the fear and loyalty that held the bando together. And as the methods became more extreme, they set the stage for something even darker. Moments where punishment ceased to be symbolic and became a brutal spectacle designed to reshape the camp from the inside out. When punishment fell upon someone inside the bond, the atmosphere shifted into something almost ritualistic, as if every man present understood that what was about to happen would define the boundaries of their world. Traitors were considered the most dangerous enemies of all, not because of their weapons, but because they struck from within. A single act of betrayal could destroy months of planning, expose hidden roots, or bring the Volantes directly to the camp without warning. For that reason, punishment for traitors had a special place in the outlaw hierarchy, a category of violence crafted to send a message so powerful that no one would dare follow the same path. The process rarely began with certainty. The accused often denied everything, sometimes with desperation, sometimes with a coldness that made the chief hesitate. But hesitation did not last long. Chiefs believed that allowing doubt to spread was more dangerous than any bullet. Once the chief declared someone a traitor, the sentence became a performance of authority. Some punishments were delivered swiftly, as if to sever the infection before it spread. Others unfolded slowly, designed to show the group what happened when loyalty fractured. A traitor might be isolated, forced to sit under the scorching sun while the camp stared in silence. Or he might be surrounded by the very men he once fought beside, their eyes avoiding his because acknowledging his fate felt too close to acknowledging their own fears. One of the cruelest aspects of these punishments was their unpredictability. Chiefs tailored the method to the nature of the betrayal, or sometimes to the depth of their own fury. A man suspected of passing information might be subjected to a punishment that left him visible to the entire group, turning his suffering into a warning carved into memory. Another, guilty of hoarding supplies or sabotaging a mission, might face a punishment designed to strip away not only his strength but his dignity. These acts were not born from mindless brutality. They were calculated tools of psychological warfare, ensuring that loyalty remained stronger than fear of external enemies. But the most disturbing punishments were those delivered without a single raised voice. The silence surrounding them made everything feel heavier, more personal. The camp would watch as the chief delivered his verdict, and the lack of explanation forced every man to interpret the scene differently. Was the traitor truly guilty? Was the chief acting out of fear, paranoia, or necessity? These questions were never answered, and that ambiguity tightened the invisible rope that kept the group unified. Ame did not need to know all the rules to follow them. He only needed to know the consequences of breaking them. Even after the punishment ended, its shadow lingered. Conversations grew sharper. Trust became more fragile. Men who once laughed together now evaluated each other with new eyes, aware that betrayal did not always announce itself. Some recruits, shaken by what they witnessed, strengthened their loyalty, believing that survival depended on absolute obedience. Others internalized the message differently, realizing how thin the line was between accused and accuser, between belonging to the group and becoming an example of what happened when loyalty cracked. These moments reshaped the group more than any battle, forging a unity built not on friendship but on the shared recognition that their world tolerated no fractures. And beneath all of it lay a question no one dared voice aloud. What if the next suspected traitor was someone they trusted, or worse, themselves? As the chiefs expanded their influence across the backlands, their punishments began to move beyond the confines of the camp. The violence they unleashed was no longer aimed solely at disciplining their own men. It became a tool of domination over entire villages, a strategy built to transform fear into obedience without firing a single shot. When a settlement refused to offer shelter, supplies, or silence, the chiefs responded with calculated brutality, choosing methods that would leave marks not only on bodies but on memories, ensuring that the story of their powers spread faster than their horses could ride. For many villagers, the first warning came long before the outlaws arrived. A mutilated tree on the edge of the settlement, a set of cryptic symbols carved into wooden posts, or a body displayed at the crossroads where every traveler passed. These signs were deliberate, crafted with precision to unsettle the mind and prime the heart for fear. Chiefs understood that if terror reached a village before they did, resistance would collapse under its own weight. By the time the Kangaseros finally rode in, the villagers were already caught in a web of anticipation, unsure whether cooperation would save them or only delay the inevitable. When punishments were delivered publicly, they became a spectacle layered with meaning. Chiefs selected locations that forced the entire community to witness the consequences of defiance. A central square, a water well where families gathered, or the entrance of the local church all became stages for these dark performances. The objective was not simply to punish one person, but to reshape the village's collective memory. A single violent act could linger for decades, passed from parent to child as a cautionary tale about what happened when people challenged men who lived outside every law except their own. Yet there was an unsettling sophistication behind these methods. Chiefs tailored their punishments to fit the social fabric of each village in places, where honor mattered more than life. They targeted respected elders to fracture the community's sense of stability. In others, they punished those who held influence, knowing that their suffering would echo through every household. This strategic cruelty was born not from chaos but from a sharp understanding of human psychology. The chiefs knew that dominating a village required more than weapons. It required breaking its will. The aftermath of these punishments often left a silence that lasted 4 days. Villagers avoided certain streets, whispered in fragments, and watched strangers with suspicion, unsure whether the outlaws would return. Even long after the Congacheros had vanished into the scrubland, the memory of their actions clung to the air like dust after a stampede. And in the minds of those who survived, a quiet question took root. Was resistance ever truly possible when the price of defiance was written in suffering for all to see? This expanding influence created an invisible map of fear across the Sertao, a network of towns and settlements marked not by geography but by the psychological imprint left behind. And as these stories spread, they gave rise to another layer of the outlaw legend, one where punishment was not just an act of retribution but a demonstration of absolute territorial control. Yet what happened to those individuals accused of aiding the Volantes or betraying outlaws' secrets to desperate families seeking protection reveals an even darker side of these strategies, one where survival became a negotiation carried out under the unforgiven sun. Those accused of collaborating with the Volantes occupied a uniquely perilous place in the outlaw world. Informants were considered far more dangerous than armed enemies because they operated in silence, manipulating trust while moving unnoticed among both sides. For the chiefs, the presence of a single informant could mean the difference between escaping an ambush or being wiped out to the last man. That fear shaped some of the harshest punishment methods ever recorded in the Kongoko era. Strategies crafted not only to eliminate the suspected traitor but to communicate a message so sharp it cut through the entire region. When a villager was suspected of guiding authorities toward the Bandos movements, the chief rarely acted immediately. Instead, he paid attention to inconsistencies in stories, sudden disappearances, or unusual confidence. When the outlaws passed through town, the chiefs understood that people betrayed for many reasons: desperation, coercion, hunger, or the simple hope of survival. But understanding motives did not soften their response. To them, aiding the Volantes was an attack on the very existence of the group, and survival demanded ruthless clarity. If the accused was captured, the interrogation often took place far from the village, in secluded areas of the Caatinga where no witness could intervene. These sessions did not rely on elaborate methods, but on psychological pressure. The chiefs wanted information first, confirmation second, and retribution last. The process could stretch for hours as the accused tried to negotiate, invent excuses, or shift blame. But inside the outlaw world, hesitation only deepened suspicion. When chiefs sensed deception, their decision hardened instantly. What followed was rarely spoken of openly, yet enough accounts surfaced over the decades to paint a chilling picture. Punishments for informants served a dual purpose, eliminating the threat and creating a narrative powerful enough to discourage others. Some chiefs left the body in a place where the entire village would see it upon waking, choosing locations symbolically tied to daily life, such as a well or a crossroads. Others ensured the body remained undiscovered long enough for rumors to spread unchecked, letting imagination intensify the punishment beyond what had actually taken place. But it was not only villagers who faced this fate. Sometimes the accused was a congachero himself, someone whose loyalty had once been unquestioned but who succumbed to fear or greed. These cases were the most devastating because betrayal from within struck at the foundation of the bando's identity. When a member was suspected of aiding the Volantes, the chief approached the situation with a frightening combination of precision and paranoia. The group gathered in tense silence, each man watching not just the accused but the chief, trying to interpret what the outcome would reveal about their own future. The psychological impact of such punishments stretched far beyond the moment they were delivered. Villagers learned to measure their words carefully when outlaws passed near their homes. Families avoided even the appearance of cooperation with authorities, knowing that survival depended on silence rather than virtue. The chiefs, for their part, grew increasingly dependent on these strategies as the pressure from Volantes intensified. The harsher the pursuit, the more drastic the punishments became, forming a cycle that hardened both the bandos and the communities trapped between them. Yet there were punishments even darker than those delivered to informants, methods whispered only in fragments by survivors who lived long enough to remember. These rituals existed in the shadows, rarely documented, often dismissed as legend. But those who research the Congako know that every legend, no matter how exaggerated, begins with a seed of truth. And the next layer of this world leads directly into those rare, secret punishments that reveal just how deeply fear and authority were intertwined under the rule of outlaw chiefs. The rarest punishments were the ones almost no one dared describe. The rituals buried so deeply in the memories of survivors that even decades later their voices trembled when recalling them. These were not the calculated displays meant to terrify villages, nor the swift executions designed to eliminate informants. These were the punishments reserved for moments when the chiefs felt the world closing in around them, when paranoia fused with authority, creating actions that blurred the line between strategy and something far more primal. Historians piece together these accounts from fragmented testimonies, contradictions, and whispers passed through generations, because these punishments existed in the liminal space where fear became mythology. These secret methods were never performed in public. They took place in remote pockets of the Caatinga areas, chosen not only for their isolation but for the symbolic weight they carried among the outlaws. Some were locations tied to past battles or losses, places where chiefs believed spirits of the fallen lingered. Others were natural formations that seemed almost designed for silence, where the wind itself hesitated as if unwilling to witness what came next. A man brought to one of these places understood instantly that he was no longer facing a punishment meant to instruct the group. He was facing something the chiefs themselves wanted no one to see. What made these rare punishments so unsettling was not their brutality alone, but the rituals surrounding them. Chiefs sometimes demanded that only a select group of their most trusted men attend, creating an inner circle bound by secrets heavier than loyalty itself. Those chosen to witness often described feeling as though they were being tested, not just observing justice but proving their commitment to the chief's authority. Years later, these same witnesses struggled to articulate what they had seen, as though the act of speaking might awaken something they had buried deep inside. Unlike other punishments, which followed predictable patterns, these secret rituals shifted in form and intention. Sometimes they were swift, driven by desperation when the bando faced imminent danger. Other times they stretched into long, silent hours where the accused was forced to confront not only the chief's judgment but the weight of his own choices. The chiefs believed that fear transformed when stripped of an audience. Without villagers watching or comrades judging, punishment became personal, raw, a confrontation between the condemned and the forces that shaped the outlaw world. It was here, in this intimate darkness, that the chiefs revealed the full extent of their power. Survivors, few as they were, described an atmosphere so heavy it seemed to alter reality. They spoke of the way the chief's voice changed, becoming distant or strangely calm. They remembered how the stars felt too bright or how the night air felt colder than it should have. These details, though small, hint at the psychological intensity of the moment. The outlaw world was built on fear, but these punishments created a fear so profound that it transformed into silence for the rest of a man's life. These hidam rituals shaped the legends that surrounded the chiefs long after their deaths. Villagers whispered that some punishments were influenced by folklore, by superstitions older than the Kangako itself. Others believed chiefs used these rituals to purge doubt within their ranks, confronting their own paranoia in the only way they knew, through acts that blurred the boundaries between justice, vengeance, and survival. Whatever the truth, these punishments reinforced the idea that the chiefs held authority not only over life and death, but over the very narratives that defined their legacy. As we venture deeper into the psychological impact of these methods, it becomes clear that the outlaw world was held together by more than fear. It was shaped by the stories men told themselves to survive, the secrets they carried, and the rituals that marked them forever. Tell me, what do you make of these hidden punishments that linger more in silence than in history? Share your thoughts in the comments, especially your interpretation of why some rituals were meant never to be seen by the world. The deeper you look into the world of the outlaw chiefs, the more it becomes clear that their punishment methods were not simply expressions of brutality. They were reflections of a complex psychology shaped by constant danger, sleepless nights, and the relentless pressure of being hunted across an unforgiving landscape. Power in the Kangoko was not merely physical. It was psychological, a delicate balance created through dominance, suspicion, and the unwavering belief that a single moment of weakness could unravel everything. In this environment, fear was not a flaw but a tool, sharpened through experience and wielded with precision. Chiefs learned early that commanding loyalty required more than charisma. It demanded an understanding of how men think when pushed to the edge. Every outlaw carried his own internal fractures: hunger, loneliness, guilt, the memory of a family left behind, or the temptation of surrendering to the authorities. Chiefs manipulated these fractures to control the group. They studied reactions, tested boundaries, and observed who hesitated during combat or who spoke too softly when questioned. These micro-observations became the foundation of their psychological strategy, informing how they delivered punishment and when. This psychological mastery also influenced the structure of the camp itself. Chiefs placed certain men closer to them not only because they trusted them, but because keeping those with influence nearby allowed tighter control. Recruits were often assigned roles that revealed their temperament under stress. Some were tasked with guiding prisoners to test whether they possessed the resolve required for harsher duties. Others were placed in scouting missions to observe how they handled isolation. Punishment, in this context, became a diagnostic tool. A man who reacted with fear might be monitored more closely. A man who watched too calmly might be considered dangerous for different reasons. But perhaps the most revealing insight comes from how chiefs perceived threats. They understood that betrayal rarely arrived with dramatic gestures. It emerged from hesitation, from subtle discontent, from the quiet erosion of loyalty. That is why many punishments seemed disproportionate or unpredictable to outsiders. The chiefs were not reacting solely to the supposed offense. They were responding to what they believed. The offense represented a fracture in the psychological architecture holding the bando together. Even minor acts of defiance were treated as indicators of deeper instability that could spread if not crushed immediately. Over time, this heightened awareness developed into a near-instinctive sense of danger. Chiefs often spoke of feeling betrayal before seeing any evidence, a perception shaped by countless encounters with deception. Whether this intuition was accurate or a product of paranoia remains debated, but its impact on the group was undeniable. Men adjusted their behavior around the chief, conscious that a single misinterpreted gesture could draw suspicion. This constant vigilance hardened them, forcing them to conform to the emotional rhythm set by the leader. Villagers felt this psychological force as well. Even when the outlaws approached peacefully, the presence of the chief altered the atmosphere. His reputation arrived ahead of him, carried by stories of punishment so striking that they shaped the reactions of anyone standing in his shadow. A village intimidated by this reputation became easier to control, reducing the need for violence. Yet the same techniques that worked on communities also deepened tension within the bando. Living under such an intense psychological regime created an environment where fear and loyalty twisted together until they became indistinguishable. This merging of psychological strategy and physical punishment formed the backbone of the outlawed chief's power. But as with any system built on pressure and control, cracks inevitably formed. And within those cracks, we find the moments when brutality backfired, when fear transformed into defiance, and when punishments intended to reinforce authority instead ignited consequences no chief could fully contain. Yet even the strongest psychological systems eventually meet their breaking point, and the outlaw chiefs were not immune to the consequences of their own severity. The punishments that once held the bando together began, in certain moments, to create fractures instead of cohesion. These were the moments when brutality miscalculated the emotional pulse of the group, when a punishment intended to strengthen loyalty instead struck at the fragile balance holding desperate men together. In these rare but transformative instances, fear shifted shape, turning inward, eroding authority, and triggering reactions the chiefs were not prepared to face. One of the clearest patterns emerges in stories where punishment was perceived as unjust. Even among hardened outlaws, a sense of fairness existed, distorted by violence, yet real enough to influence group morale. When a chief punished someone based on suspicion rather than evidence, or acted too quickly in anger, the group sometimes interpreted it as a sign of instability. A leader who appeared unstable threatened the survival of everyone, because decisions made from paranoia could lead the entire bando into disaster. Men began watching not only the accused but the chief himself, analyzing whether the punishment reflected strength or weakness disguised as dominance. Insomikazis. The punished man was someone deeply liked or admired, a veteran fighter, a loyal scout, or a young recruit who had proven himself repeatedly. When one of these men was subjected to severe retribution, the emotional weight shifted inside the camp. Silence deepened. Conversations grew tense. Outlaws exchanged glances that suggested questions none of them dared ask aloud. A chief might sense this tension too late, realizing that a single act of excessive cruelty had changed the internal chemistry of the group. And in the wilderness, where survival depended on unity, such shifts could be deadly. Historical accounts suggest that a few punishments even sparked quiet rebellions, not dramatic uprisings, but small acts of resistance. A man refusing to carry out an order with the same enthusiasm, another hesitating before joining a raid, a third avoiding eye contact with the chief for fear that anger might expose the doubt growing inside him. None of these gestures could topple a leader alone, but together they formed a dangerous underworld. When enough men felt the chief had crossed a line, the group's loyalty became brittle, vulnerable to internal collapse. There were also cases in which the punished man's family or friends within the bando intervened indirectly. They could not challenge the chief outright, but they might begin subtly undermining his decisions, questioning roots, or suggesting alternative plans. This slow erosion of authority often went unnoticed until the effects could no longer be contained. A chief who relied too heavily on fear discovered that fear alone did not guarantee obedience. If men followed only because they were terrified, the moment that terror misfired, obedience could crumble with startling speed. Villages sometimes reacted similarly. A punishment delivered too violently could push a community not toward submission but toward desperation. Some villages formed hidden alliances with rival groups, or even the villains, believing that any risk was worth escaping the shadow cast by the outlaws. In those moments, brutality became counterproductive, drawing more enemies instead of silencing them. These failures did not happen often, but when they did, they exposed the limits of a power built on intimidation. They revealed that even in the harsh world of the Kingako, fear could only stretch so far before snapping. And in the wake of those rare collapses came the stories that shaped the darker legends of the chiefs, tales that hinted at vulnerability behind their ruthless facade. But what these fractures ultimately created was something far more enduring, a legacy, a shadow that stretched far beyond the lifetimes of the men who delivered these punishments, shaping folklore, memory, and the very identity of the circle. That legacy becomes the final piece of this journey, where punishment transforms from immediate terror into something that echoes across generations. The aftermath of these punishments did not end with the men who endured them. Their shadows stretched far beyond the camps, embedding themselves into the memory of the Sertao, as if the land itself refused to forget. Stories of outlaw chiefs and their ruthless methods drifted across generations, shifting and reshaping as they passed through. Countless voices. Some accounts softened the brutality, turning it into legend. Others amplified it, transforming the chiefs into figures so fearsome that even their names carried a weight that unsettled those who whispered them. In a world where history and folklore often collided, the punishments became more than events. They became symbols. Families told children never to wander near old trails rumored to have been used by the villagers left offerings at crossroads where certain punishments were said to have taken place, not out of reverence, but out of fear that the spirits of the condemned still roamed nearby. Travelers avoided dry riverbeds at night, believing that echoes of suffering lingered there. Whether these beliefs were rooted in truth or imagination mattered little. The fear they carried ensured that the chiefs remained present long after their guns fell silent. What is most striking is how these stories evolve into cultural markers. Some described the chiefs as protectors who punished only those who threatened the poor. Others painted them as cruel tyrants who crushed anyone in their path. The truth, as always, existed somewhere between these extremes. Their punishments were shaped by desperation, survival, and the psychological battles waged inside every outlaw who lived with a price on his head. And because these forces were universal, the stories endured, resonating with each new generation that grappled with power, fear, and justice. Even the Volantes, who dedicated their lives to hunting the bandos, could not escape the influence of these legacies. Reports written by officers often carried a tone of uneasy respect, acknowledging that the chiefs held their own kind of authority. Some documents implied that the discipline within the band, created through punishment and fear, was more effective than the organizational systems of the authorities meant to stop them. This unintended admiration contributed to the myth, elevating the chiefs from criminals to archetypes of rebellion, danger, and raw human will. Modern researchers still debate the accuracy of many accounts, recognizing that the Sertao has always blended fact with storytelling. But even if certain details are exaggerated, the emotional truth remains. The punishments left marks not only on bodies, but on identity, weaving themselves into the fabric of the region until they became inseparable from its history. In this sense, the outlaw chiefs shaped the Sertao as much as drought, struggle, and resilience did. Their legacy continues to haunt the landscape, a reminder of how fear, authority, and survival collide in places where law is shaped by those who carry the most power. And now that you have walked through these layers of brutality, psychology, and myth, it becomes easier to understand why these stories refuse to fade. They reveal something universal about the human instinct to control, to resist, to endure. They expose the cost of Power in the ways fear can sculpt societies long after the men who inspired it are gone. If you've reached this point, let me know by leaving the phrase "I am with you until the end" in the comments. If this journey through the hidden world of the outlaw chiefs brought you new insights, consider subscribing so you can keep exploring stories like this with me. And if the narrative connected with you, a simple like helps bring more people into these forgotten histories. There is another video waiting that deepens this universe even further, so follow the one on the side and continue this story with me.